Okay, I think that we'll get started here. Thanks a lot again, everyone, for coming to tonight's webinar. We're going to be discussing population size tonight. I guess a little bit of a note, I am not a professional plant breeder. I'm not a geneticist. A lot of what we're talking about today with population size is very specific to seed saving at home. We will discuss genetics to a very lightly. If you have other questions, I'll sort of refer you to some different resources at the end of the presentation. I hope you feel comfortable asking any questions that come up by typing them there in the chat window as well. For those of you just getting to know Seed Savers Exchange, our mission is to save North America's diverse but endangered garden heritage for future generations by building a network of people committed to collecting, conserving, and sharing heirloom seeds and plants while educating people about the value of genetic and cultural diversity. And so, as I mentioned, tonight we'll be discussing population size. Talking about population size related to seed saving would be the number of plants that you have growing out in your garden that will be, depending on the plant type, they may be sharing pollen, but the population size is the number of plants that you'll be saving seed from. There's about 50 of you here. This is probably the most specific webinar we've done, and it's great to see so many of you somewhat interested in population size. There's sort of a kind of a fuzzy distinction that we can make between two different types of plants that you might have growing in your garden. Very sort of grossly, we have inbreeders and we have outbreeders. And inbreeders are primarily self-pollinating. If you've attended other webinars or if you're familiar with seed saving, you'll know that inbreeders are primarily self-pollinating. Peas and beans, many tomatoes, lettuce, those are very inbreeding. It's unlikely that pollen is going to be shared between two different plants. Outbreeders, on the other hand, are primarily pollinated by other plants. So cabbage, for example, doesn't have the ability to pollinate itself. It needs pollen from other plant sources. Carrots, onions, melons, these are all very likely, if there are other plants with appropriate sources of pollen nearby, these plant types are very likely to be pollinated with pollen from other sources. And certainly there are degrees of inbreeding and outbreeding. A plant like okra, for example, or hot peppers, these plants have the ability to self-pollinate. They can be inbreeding, but they're also very attractive to insects, other sort of pollination vectors. And in general, with population size, if you walk away with understanding anything from this presentation, generally when you're maintaining a variety, outbreeders require larger populations, and larger has sort of a different meaning depending on your context. If you're growing seeds to share with other folks, if you're growing seeds commercially, or if you're just growing seeds at home, and we'll discuss some of these different levels a little bit later on in the presentation here. A few reasons to maintain appropriate population sizes. The first would be to prevent inbreeding depression in the plants that you have. If anyone has grown corn, carrots, onions, if you've saved seed for many of these plants, if you've saved seed for several generations of these plants, you'll notice that if your population is not large enough, the plants will eventually, through the generations, become less vigorous. The yield might decrease. The plants may be more susceptible to pests and diseases. As I mentioned, this isn't really a genetics presentation. Inbreeding depression also is it's not quite understood fully, but there is some thought that inbreeding depression is largely the product of having too many homozygous genes. If you look on this graph here, you'll see this is a Punnett square. Maybe some of you are familiar with this from high school biology or maybe a little bit later in college. So this Punnett square here shows a capital A for a dominant gene and a small a for a recessive gene. When there are two large A's or two small A's, those would be homozygous because they have the same alleles that are there. On the other hand, you see that there are two squares here. that have a large A and a small a, those would be heterozygous. And it's assumed that that heterozygous expression produces more vigorous plants, and the plants with the homozygous expressions would then be more susceptible to diseases, pests, insects, less vigorous. They would have qualities that are a little bit less desirable, I guess I would say. It's not always the case, but in this slide here, this is as far into genetics as we're going to go here. If you look at this slide here, these are with ponies, so it's not with plants. When you're saving seed from a small population, increasingly the plants that you save seed from become closer and closer related. When you have plants that are very closely related, there's a greater chance to pass on certain recessive alleles that may be disadvantageous to the plant. So in this photograph, in this diagram here, we have the ponies on top. We have one with homozygous dominant alleles, and then we have the heterozygous alleles with a recessive deleterious allele expressed. So in the first generation here, you can see that two of the ponies have inherited this deleterious allele. When they are bred together, there is a chance that those deleterious alleles will be expressed homozygously, and it may be that because they're recessive, the only time that they're expressed is when they appear homozygously like this, when they're both recessive and there's not a dominant, and it may be that that has some sort of negative effect on the plant that's really going to hinder production or really going to hinder vigor. Whereas you can see in the bottom right there, another where it says inbreeding, there's been a different influx of genetic information that makes it less likely that both of those alleles will be expressed there. What can also occur in your population if you do not have a large population size is genetic drift. And this is a great illustration of genetic drift on the screen here. Genetic drift is simply the change in the frequency of genes in a population over time. So in the far left, it's 50-50, 50% red, 50% blue. A random sample in the next generation might result in what you see there with a little more blue. Over time, it may become less likely that those red genes or those red traits are expressed, and so you can see at the far right in that jar, everything is blue, and that red trait has been entirely lost. And so if you're saving seed from smaller populations, you have a greater chance of really skewing traits one way or another. So if you, for example, only selected in the jar on the left, if you only selected 4 of those marbles, 4 of those dots, and moved them into the next generation, if you only saved offspring from 4 dots, it's a greater chance that it might be 3 blues and 1 red, or maybe all blues just in that first selection. The greater your population size, then, the greater probability you have of selecting each trait. Something that folks are often interested in doing in their garden is making selections. So they will have, in this example, they have these eggplants growing out in their garden, and they really like when there's very little purple shown on the plant. And so they look at one plant, and most of the eggplants on that one plant are white or mostly white, and so they'll decide just to save seeds from that one plant. When you do that, you've created a huge sort of genetic bottleneck. So you have decided that this one trait is very important to you, and now unfortunately every subsequent generation is going to maybe have a higher likelihood of expressing that trait of being very white. However, it can also have other implications. You may be selecting for things that you're not consciously selecting for. It may be that you just selected one plant that is maybe not quite as tolerant to cold, or it's more susceptible to pests or diseases or viruses. When you save seeds from just one plant or just a few plants, and you think folks do this often with really big fruit, it might be that you're saving seed from the biggest eggplant that you have. But that also, if you're only saving seeds from a couple of plants and they're the biggest plants, you may be selecting for other things that you're not conscious of, like I mentioned, more susceptibility to diseases or viruses. And so it's important to have a mixture, even if you want to have the largest eggplants of your particular variety. It's important that you're also saving seeds from several other plants that maybe aren't necessarily the biggest, because you want to have that diversity of genetic information. Variability in a population and adaptability are very closely related, and so if you have a population with a large sort of diverse set of genes and you plant them out, maybe there's a drought or there's a flood or there's a lot of pressure from a particular pest, that variability will help your population of plants to endure that particular pressure. I'm going to talk a little bit about some specifics, because I know kind of what we've talked about now is a little bit heady, and so I want to give some very concrete, specific examples. The numbers that I'm going to be talking about here are sort of the recommended minimum number of plants that you should be growing in your garden if you want to be maintaining a variety over several generations. So if you want to be saving seed from these particular striped Roma tomatoes every year or every couple of years, for the rest of your life, what is the minimum number of plants you should really have? With extreme inbreeders, and again, this is if you're kind of maintaining these varieties if you're planning to maintain these varieties for several generations. If you are just saving seed for your own home use, we'll kind of discuss that at the end as well. For extreme inbreeders like tomatoes, peas, beans, lettuce, you're safe to have 10 to 20, probably for all the varieties I mentioned, or all the plant types that I mentioned, 10 tomato plants that you'd be saving seed from year after year. For moderate inbreeders, things like okra, eggplant that I mentioned, hot peppers as well, about 40 plants would be ideal. And so far we've talked a lot about, we've talked quite a bit about inbreeders. Outbreeders are inbreeders and outbreeders. I guess the genetic structure of a population of plants of an inbreeding variety is very different from that, from the population of an outbreeding variety. These outbreeders here, they really require pollen to be shared between a number of plants, and so you're not just saving seed from plants that are self-pollinating, so you're preventing really heavy selection for a mutation or something. But with cabbages and kale, with corn, beets, Swiss chard, carrots, with all these plants, they really are sharing pollen between one another, and so they have a very different number of plants that you need to save seed from, but also kind of a whole different way that they're combining genes. With most outbreeders, about 80 plants is necessary to really maintain the integrity of that particular variety. Cabbages, kale, kohlrabi, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, all the brassicas would be outbreeders requiring about 80 plants. Beets and Swiss chard would be great to have 80 plants as well. Spinach. And there are a few plants that are very, very susceptible to inbreeding depression for one reason or another. Corn is one of the most notorious sort of plant types that's very, very susceptible to inbreeding depression. And so it's recommended that you grow, that you are saving seed. You should be sharing pollen between 200 plants if you plan on saving seed from corn for a number of generations. This is also the same for onions and carrots. These three are very susceptible to inbreeding depression. You really need a very large population to prevent that. However, there are some plants, some outbreeders that make it a little bit easier. All of the cucurbits, so melons, watermelons, squash, cucumbers, these are all outbreeders that are not very susceptible to inbreeding depression, and so you can get away with growing 10 to 20 of these plants in your garden if you're growing these plants to save seed from and share that seed with other people or offer it commercially or through the yearbook. Cucurbits are sort of the exception. They are outbreeding, but they're not sensitive to inbreeding depression, and so you can grow smaller population sizes. This is a sort of a quick note. If you are familiar with the history of your variety, and this probably comes up more if you're maintaining a family heirloom, maybe that's been passed down through several generations of your family, population size and sort of varietal history are linked, in that if your grandmother, for example, was growing a pea in her garden and saving pea seeds year after year after year, And since she's had this variety, she's always had a large population of peas. She's always saved peas from 40 or 50 plants that she's got in her garden. It's more important that you're growing a large population size to maintain all the different characteristics of the plant. If you inherit, or if you get a pea or some other plant variety that has always had a large population size and you only save seed from 5 plants, very quickly that has an impact on the traits of that particular pea, and suddenly you're really only selecting for the most common traits, and you're losing some of those rarer traits that might be present in that particular variety. If, on the other hand, you are saving seeds from a modern open pollinated tomato, those have gone through a pretty rigorous selection process. It may be that at one time the population size wasn't more than a dozen plants, and it could be even fewer. So if you're saving seeds from a plant that has never had a history of having a large sample size, you can get away with having a smaller population. And there's an important distinction between planting size and population size. If you are, and again, this is mostly commercial, or if you're producing seed on a very large scale, there are several folks that recommend planting 50% above and beyond the plants that you intend to save seed from, or planting twice as many plants even as the plants that you'd like to save seed from. Understanding that half of the seeds that you plant might not come up. They might, there's some sort of attrition that happens there, and so they won't fully mature. It may be that you're thinning them out, things like that. When you're planting something, like when you're starting tomato seeds, for example, and you really are wanting to save seeds from 10 different tomato plants, try to start 20 tomato seeds. If you have leftovers that don't fit in your garden, it's easy to find a home for those, but really, like, your planting size should be significantly large to account for any sort of attrition that happens in your population, any disappearance of plants from diseases or pests or weather conditions, things like that. And so this is a very important distinction that I want to make here, is that the numbers that I've been discussing have primarily, maybe not necessarily been, a lot of them have been on a commercial scale, maybe at the lower end of a commercial scale of production. If you're saving seeds at home and you really want to, grow out a variety just for your own use, you're not planning on selling the seeds or sharing the seeds, you could get away with half or fewer probably of the number of plants in your garden. So with tomatoes, for example, if you're just saving your own seeds at home for a tomato, you could save seeds from 4 or 5 tomato plants. You wouldn't, particularly for these inbreeding plants, you really wouldn't see any change in the number of generations that you're growing them out, because again, hopefully you'd grow out a large enough population that you could save seeds from tomato plants in 1 year and have enough seed for the next 5 to 10 years. And so it'll be another 5 to 10 years before you really force that selection pressure on that particular variety. In your lifetime, you won't notice any real degradation of that variety for these inbreeding plants. That said, if you have a variety that's very rare, if you have a variety that has been in your family for a number of generations, or a variety that isn't offered commercially anymore, a variety that you don't know where you can source the seeds from, it is more important that you have a larger population size. As I want to talk about next, there are a couple ways to sort of reacquire genetic diversity in your population, but all of them rely on additional sources of seed and plants of that particular variety. If you're at home and you want to produce seed for, let's say you want to produce seed for a number of eggplants. I certainly in my home garden don't have room to grow 40 plants, 40 eggplant plants. And even if I did, I don't really have that space in my garden to grow 40 eggplants and then not be able to eat them, or not be able to eat most of the fruits that mature on that plant, because they'll need to go to seed maturity, which, at the point that the seeds are ready, the fruit is quite disgusting at that point. And this is true for like snap beans and green beans. There are some plants that when you save seed from them, you're not going to be able to eat them. But again, on the other hand, if you're saving seeds from tomatoes or from dry beans, you can eat the fruit and save those seeds, so you may have more room for those types of plants. But something like cabbage, for example, nobody that I know has room in their home garden to grow 80 cabbage plants and then not eat any of them and just save seed from them. So on a home scale, you can really get away with far fewer. And 20 cabbage plants is still a lot, but it's not as many as 80. Really, the only way to reacquire genetic diversity in your population is to find seeds of the particular variety that you're maintaining. Find seeds that have been in someone else's care, or find seeds from a commercial seed company of that same variety that have been maintained differently, and they will have a different set of genetics. There's a couple ways that I've listed here that I believe these are listed in Seed to Seed as well. A couple ways about to go about reacquiring some seeds of your particular variety. You'll need a sort of an influx of new genetic information. So a recommendation that Suzanne Ashworth makes, and that I would wholeheartedly agree with, is to use the Seed Savers Exchange Yearbook, if you remember, to locate other growers who are maintaining your variety. It's likely that you're not, depending on the variety, but it's likely that someone else out there, if you receive this particular variety from the yearbook, or if you receive the variety from a commercial seed company that no longer offers it, you can try to find it through the yearbook and get another sample of seeds. You can contact us, Seed Savers Exchange, directly. Maybe we have this variety in our collection. We don't offer it through the yearbook, but it might be that we have this variety in our collection, and we'd be willing to grow it out and share seeds with you in the future. We can also perhaps point you to other potential sources. You can maybe look through old yearbooks and find people that may have offered that variety in the past, and they may be holding on to some seed along that line as well. You can contact seed companies, even if they're not offering it currently. You can contact seed companies who may have offered your variety in the past to get another sample of seeds. Oftentimes they will have stocks of old seed that they're willing to part with. Another source of seeds for your particular variety would be the USDA's online GRIN database. It's a germplasm network, so it lists many different varieties, a lot of them old commercial varieties that the USDA has in their collection, or they know the location where it's being maintained. The website is listed there. I want to say thanks to everyone for coming, and if you have any additional questions, again, you can kind of refer to the resources that I've listed here, but feel free to contact us too, education@seedsavers.org, and I can kind of refer you to some other resources if I don't have the answer myself. All right, well, take care, everyone. Have a great night, and hope to see you again at future webinars.